Thank you. Thanks everyone for having me here. I did want to give an update on one of our grant applications. We were awarded a grant from the Department of Apprenticeship Standards as a region. Riverside County Workforce Development is the lead on that grant, and that grant will serve 380 apprentices, excuse me, and they will cover several different industry sectors, including manufacturing, healthcare, civil service, and transportation and logistics. That grant is slated to start in July. Most of you were present when we were on our campaign for our Good Jobs Challenge grant. That is a much larger national grant, and they are still in the evaluating phase. So as soon as we hear anything, we will let you all know. And we have started back up doing our job fairs. So if you are interested in participating in the job fairs that we host, I'll be glad to place the information in the chat for you to reach out to our business services unit. If you guys have any questions, I'm open for those now.
Well, congratulations, Shanice, and thanks very much. Yvonne, not to put you on the spot, but do you have anything to report from Intech Center?
Let's see. Well, we have a graduating class tomorrow, June 23rd. We'll have a graduating class of our welding students. July 11th, we will launch our new pre-apprenticeship program, which is automation, mechatronics, and robotics. I think I've got that mixed up. Automation, robotics, and mechatronics pre-apprenticeship program. And we have a graduating class of industrial, electrical, and mechanical pre-apprenticeship trainees. They'll be graduating August 17th. And we'll start doing employer recruitment sessions, inviting employers. We've been doing it for the past year or so, year and a half or so via Zoom. And I'm not certain if we're going to make that transition and go back to face-to-face, but those are some of the things that are happening right now.
Good, thank you very much. Pretty well on, when I put you on the spot there. But we've decided that we could fit in a couple announcements before we actually start the meeting.
I do have one more. We actually are launching, if I could please, we are launching a new registered apprenticeship, and that's for mechatronics technicians. So the three registered apprenticeship programs that we have to help companies upskill their current workers are the industrial maintenance electrician, the industrial mechanic, and now the one we're going to launch at the end of July or August is mechatronics technician. So we're excited about that.
Great, that's a good addition. And that brings us up to 4 o'clock, and we're going to start. I'm Molly Burgess from the Manufacturers Council, and we welcome you to this event. We have a few announcements of our own before we get started. Just a reminder that this meeting will be recorded. We have had 2 great presentations on this 3-part supply chain topic. Last month, Steve Harrington, who's the Senior Advisor for Manufacturing Skills Standards Council, gave an outstanding program with plenty of stats and data. And if you missed that program, I'd recommend that you go back and watch the video. All of our meeting videos are located at our website, mfgcouncilie.com, on the events page. And you just scroll down to the past events and you'll see they're highlighted in blue, and that's the link that will take you to the video. Today's event will be, Vincent will be able to post that by tomorrow afternoon, along with the PowerPoint slides from today. I would also like to invite you to become a member of the MCIE. It's an easy way to help us out. And plus, it doesn't cost anything right now, but it will allow you to receive information about upcoming events. As you know, the MCIE works to provide value to our regional manufacturers, and we are already working on programs that all the way through October. So coming in July, nothing. July will be dark and everybody's invited to go on vacation. And then for August, we are planning a manufacturing tour of one of our plants that will be very limited in size. We don't have the details yet, but that will be posted, be sent out to members. In September, we're hoping that we can put together a port tour. And I think the weather will be better for September. It's really a lot of fun. And I think we'll be able to have probably about 30 people attend. And then in October, which is manufacturing month, we're planning on a live event for manufacturers and educators. The goal of this event is to inform administrators and teachers and counselors about career opportunities for their students in the manufacturing industry. So stay tuned for more information on that. In addition, Launch, which is the region's apprenticeship program, is sponsoring the region's first 25 under 25 awards to recognize young leaders in the manufacturing industry. And we're looking for talented individuals who are 25 years old or younger and who have worked in the industry for at least 6 months. So please consider your own employees who may qualify. Give your company a little bit of recognition as well. And if you would like a flyer, just put a comment in the chat box and Vincent will send you the flyer concerning 25 under 25 awards. And of course, we want to take time to thank our major sponsor, California Manufacturing Technology Consulting, for their support. And today I would like to introduce Mickey Marafino. She's the Strategic Partnerships Manager, and she is going to tell us some things about the programs that they have. Mickey, go ahead.
Okay, great. I have a short little PowerPoint presentation and 3 minutes. So I'm gonna whiz through it and it will be available with the recording and then I'll drop it into the chat too. So CMTC is California Manufacturing Technology Consulting. And this is going to be a quick overview of CMTC, CMN, and MEP. Next slide. And then the next slide. So CMTC is actually part of a broader network under the Department of Commerce. And then under NIST, the National Institutes of Standards and Technology, is an organization called MEP. There's an MEP, Manufacturing Extension Partnership, in every state. And CMTC is the MEP in California. And we also happen to be the largest MEP in the country. Next slide. This is just an overview of all of the different MEPs, and there are very few that even have MEP in their name. So I guess that might make it a little bit confusing for people, but just to understand that we are part of a very large and broad network. Next slide. So CMTC has actually developed a network within California, and that's where I come into play with strategic partnerships. And MCIE is one of our strategic partners and part of California's manufacturing network. And the reason we do this is because we need to cover the entire state of California. And of course, we don't really have enough people to do that. So through our partnerships, we can extend our reach throughout the entire state of California. And our partners are responsible for reaching out to over 2,000 manufacturers themselves. So it's a huge part of CMTC is working with our partners, and we are very appreciative of all of their work. Next slide. One program that we offer that's a no-cost or a no-cost program is called CMA Plus. This is a self-implemented program that's facilitated by a coach through CMTC. It's 24 hours of guidance, and it falls into a lot of different categories of needs that manufacturers have. Next slide. So these are the services that we offer, but there are a lot of CMA Plus programs that fall into these categories as well, with increasing sales, with marketing programs and sales, developing websites, reducing costs, looking at lean manufacturing, improving quality. Next slide. workforce development, technology, supply chain, which is something we'll be talking about in a lot of detail today. And next slide. Growth and management and resilience. So these are, as I mentioned, these are programs that have offset funding because we are funded by the federal government and funded by the state. Next slide. And so even some of our for-fee programs have offset funding so that we can provide services at a lower cost to the manufacturers through ETP programs for training, and also workforce development funds and special cybersecurity programs. So we have several different pockets of funding that we can put towards the services that we offer to manufacturers. Next slide. And this is our contact information. I'm Mickey, and Lori has been working with CMTC for over 25 years, and we can help you with, point you in the right direction. You can work directly through MCIE or give us a call and we can help you out.
Any questions for Mickey? Well, thank you so much. And we appreciate everything that you do for us.
I was wondering, oh dear. I'll ask the question later.
That was Judy from Microdyne. So thanks, Mickey. And now we will go into our main program on supply chain disruption, part 3, managing cargo movement. Elizabeth Glynn will be the moderator of this discussion. She's an advisor on export strategy and operations and the president of EMG Global Business Solutions. Elizabeth works with manufacturers to access and maximize, sales growth across global markets, and she's a longtime supporter of the MCIE. Elizabeth will go ahead and introduce the additional guest speakers, and there will be time for questions. Although I think you can put questions in chat, and as we have a pause, we can probably pick up on those as well. Elizabeth, you want to go ahead?
Thank you, Molly. Good to be here. Hello, everyone. Today we're going to do part 3, and this is going to be a continuation of the supply chain disruption. This afternoon, it's going to be a focus on supply chain because that of course is a very critical issue. And there's 2 parts to the program. We're going to start with an overview with Dr. Tom O'Brien and Elizabeth Warren. And then part 2 will be Jane Tierney talking about the supply issues and what maybe manufacturers can do. And a lot of this is just to bring in the enhancement. The first part that Dr. O'Brien will talk about, and Elizabeth, they were instrumental at facilitating a summit this past September that brought together a lot of different entities with the focus of finding a solutions approach. So I think you'll find it very interesting. Allow me to introduce Dr. Thomas O'Brien. He is the Executive Director for the Center of International Trade and Transportation at Cal State Long Beach, and also the Deputy Director of the Matrons Transportation Consortium, a partnership of Cal State Long Beach and the University of Southern California. As well, he serves as the Director of the Southwest Transportation Workforce Center, one of 5 regional workforce centers originally funded by the Federal Highway Administration. And he previously served as CITD's Director of Research. So he brings a tremendous amount of insight and expertise. Also participating with Dr. O'Brien will be Elizabeth Warren. She is the President and CEO of Dialed In Partners. But in addition, she's the Senior Industry Liaison for the Center of International Trade and Transportation, also at Cal State Long Beach. So she is, let's see, in this role, she brings 25 years in building relationships in transportation, goods movement, supply chain, and international trade to facilitate stakeholder outreach, supporting the programs and the projects within the Center for International Trade and Transportation. With that, I'd like to introduce both of them. Go ahead, Dr. O'Brien.
Thank you. And Elizabeth and I are going to sort of tag team this. And Vincent, you'll be controlling the slides. Is that correct?
Right.
There we go. Perfect. I know we don't have a lot of time. And Elizabeth, what I thought I would do was maybe just set it up with the background and turn it over to you when we start talking about the workshop. Just by way of introduction, CITT, our center, is actually a self-support unit within the College of Professional and Continuing Education at Cal State Long Beach. And why is that important? Partly because we're of a state university, but we don't take state funding for our programs. We have to act a little bit entrepreneurial in identifying research activities that are meaningful for our industry partners in trade and transportation, and designing training programs and education programs that also are meaningful to the people who are in this industry. And I think because we sort of exist at the intersection of academia and practitioners, it's why the state, the Governor's Office of Business and Economic Development came to us last year and wanted to use sort of our neutral broker role as a way to bring together people from different aspects of the supply chain to try to focus on short-term solutions to give the supply chain some relief from the pressures that everyone was experiencing, both the people who moved the goods and those of us who were consumers. So that's sort of the background of why we were asked to gather data on what was most important to the stakeholders involved in the supply chain, including the consumers, and how we could get to meaningful solutions in a way that wasn't just rehashing the same old problems. This was happening at the time where the state was hearing a lot about why is this happening and what's the role of the state. And the federal government was also looking to find its way and figure out what it could do to help without getting in the way. And at the same time that sort of an ombudsman or a key point person was identified by the Biden administration. So that's the background for what we did. So next slide. As I mentioned, the governor's office reached out to us initially, but came to the table with a number of partners. In addition to those of us at the university and with our partners at Metrans, CalSTA, the State Transportation Agency, which includes Caltrans, was a key partner, as well as the Port of Long Beach and then the Port of Oakland, when we started to find out that agricultural concerns were paramount, along with the state's California Department of Food and Agriculture. And together, this was sort of the working group that brought about the California Supply Chain Success Initiative. Next slide. The purpose was to move beyond the identification of problems and issues and focus on short-term, meaning 30 to 90 days, as well as building the infrastructure for long-term problem solving. A lot of the supply chain works in silos. We wanted to find cross-cutting issues that people could agree to. We wanted to engage in a solution-based dialogue across a wide spectrum of stakeholders. While the ports were perhaps front and center, we understood that you can't decongest the ports if the rest of your supply chain is congested. So we looked at a wide spectrum of stakeholders. We wanted to build consensus on short and long-term solutions. We brought facilitators in who weren't afraid to maybe knock some heads and ask people to compromise. And we wanted to establish bridge to other efforts and other dialogues that were happening, particularly at the federal level. Next slide. We focused on a key set of questions that we shared with all of the parties involved, so that we felt would give us, ask people to focus on solutions and the role that they played, and also asking what they might be able to give up for the betterment of the entire supply chain. So we asked, what do we do to add value to the supply chain? We wanted to know what success looked like for your organization, so we could see where there was overlap and consensus building there. We asked what obstacles were preventing you from getting there, expecting a range of answers that included regulatory impediments, technological impediments, and incentive-based impediments that reflected the desire of supply chain stakeholders not to share information with their competitors. We asked what the risks are of doing nothing, which are not surprisingly significant. And we wanted to know what the appropriate role for government is, as we had there was newfound attention on their part. Next slide. The initiative components started broad and then moved narrow. We started with a social media campaign and solicited videos, short, brief videos from anybody who wanted to offer maybe sometimes out-of-the-box solutions. We prepared a discussion guide that was meant to be and to accompany the effort, which provided some grounding facts about the importance of the logistics and supply chain sector, and by extension, manufacturing, of course, to the California economy. With that information in place, we designed a virtual workshop using the Remo platform, so it reflected as much as possible the look and feel of an in-person meeting, where we addressed the key questions and came out with a set of priority actions that then became the focus of an invitation-only in-person decision-maker summit that was held at the Port of Long Beach in September. That was followed up by a similar summit at the Port of Oakland that focused on the state's agriculture sector, because we learned through the earlier process that the ag sector was responding and reacting to a lot of things that were happening at the ports of LA and Long Beach and in Southern California supply chains. We are in the process of finalizing a summary report in conjunction with our partners at the state level. And I'll turn it over to Elizabeth now, maybe to walk us through some of the key findings and issues that came out of the discussions and where there was some general agreement. So next slide.
Thank you, Tom. And thank you, Elizabeth, for the invitation and for the introduction. So following on to what Tom just presented, we talked about, whoops, can we go back? Was that the previous? Yeah, this slide, Vincent, thank you. Some of the questions that we wanted to ask was, what can we do to make intermodal systems more efficient? As we know that from working in the industry, it is a very complex system and there's a lot of moving parts. Sharing data is important. So how can we improve visibility within that supply chain? And then what strategies will allow the supply chain to respond to rapidly changing demand? As the pandemic has progressed, we certainly saw an acceleration of cargo moving in and out of the ports because our needs as consumers was changing. So the supply chain was trying very desperately to respond to that consumer demand. And then what can government partners at all levels do to facilitate efficient and sustainable flow of goods? So it's not only the ports at the first level of entry at the coastline, it's also government partners throughout the entire state and also on a national level as well. And what can we do to keep that cargo moving? Next slide. So I don't know, Tom, we didn't really talk about too much about how we got all of those, how we went about getting the questions. Elizabeth Glenn was part of us helping to facilitate getting questions through our social media outreach, through a roundtable discussions with industry partners, and then where we gathered a lot of information and then really drilled down into some of those most pressing needs, because we only had a limited amount of time. So the workshop that we held as Tom mentioned, with the Remo platform really gave us a lot of great information. And through that, we were able to take that information to a summit, which was invitation only and the only participants at high level throughout the supply chain. So we had representatives from the trucking industry, from the shipping lines, from labor, from warehouse distribution, chassis providers, all the transportation providers, and anyone who was involved with moving that cargo. But we could only have about 25 people in the room, so we only had like 2 representatives that were highly respected in the industry. And with that process, we were able to get them to come together, as Tom said, to come together and to really talk about how they would address these issues and what they could do from their own standpoint. So what we found is that we needed a systems approach to all of these solutions. It's kind of like having the orchestra without a conductor. All these moving parts and no one really in charge of the entire system. What we found was that we needed a way to integrate all of these multiple systems at different stages throughout the supply chain. The ocean carriers and the ports didn't communicate with each other. There was no planning for contingencies. So there was no way to kind of look at what that data would be. And as we all know, the supply chain is an incredibly dynamic system. It's constantly changing on a daily basis, even on an hourly basis. So stakeholders really must be able to analyze those changes and to figure out how to integrate that information as it comes through the system in order to be able to accommodate the need for labor at the ports, for trucks, when to have the trucking appointments set up. As manufacturers, you need to know how to plan for your supply chain and when to expect that cargo to, those raw materials or finished materials coming into the ports. How will you be able to get that information? And when there's changes, how are you able to integrate that into your supply chain planning? Next slide, please. So these are a few more of the findings, looking at ways to share that data through digitalization. A little bit of a tongue twister there. There are some systems that are currently in place. The Port of Los Angeles has a system. I know the Port of Long Beach is looking at a system, but it's still kind of proprietary. It's only open to people who are signed up for it. And so it's not open to the general public of the manufacturing and supply chain industry. But this information can really help to look at the routes prior to real time, prior to shipping, real-time decision-making, in being able to update that information, whether it's a natural disaster or when there's a congestion. And then getting that standardization for data where it's not only throughout the West Coast of the US, but also throughout the entire US and even internationally. So getting that standardization is critical. As you all know, that different stages of the supply chain, we're going to have very different, different requirements for data for that capability as well. There's really no central high-level overview of information available. So that's part of this need for having some platforms where that information can be shared. And then this goes down to the data, the equipment, the technical capabilities as well. We're looking at how can we use the 5G networks, how can we get consumer demand forecasting integrated, and then warning systems for natural disasters. Next slide, please, Vincent. And we'll talk about workshop development in just a second, workforce development. But just to wrap up that previous slide, one of the things that we talked about was who would be involved in developing this. Would this be something that was driven by industry, or would this be something that would be driven by government? If we're looking at government, then who's going to be in charge of that information? Is that a federal government? Is it state government? And how do we get everyone talking on the same platforms? And then, of course, who's going to fund it? Because something like this would take years to develop and cost exorbitant amounts of money. So we also talked about workshop and workforce development and trained labor retention. Workforce retention is critical in all sectors of industry right now. And whether it's a restaurant, whether it's airlines, everyone is having trouble retaining their workforce. So certainly the supply chain, it has equal problems with that. We know that there's need for truckers, warehouse workers are in dire need of warehouse workers and also able to retain those workers. The workforce that's out there now has different ideas of what they're willing to work for. There's a lot of unionization going on in various sectors. So looking at the workforce and how we can train and retain those workers is critical. Educational institutions, community colleges, they can certainly play a large role in developing training programs. There's worker safety programs needed as well. And then what is the role for the government in supporting this worker development and training? There's a lot of need for investment in our workforce in order to publicize those job opportunities. There's all kinds of jobs available in supply chain, but how do we get people to know about those jobs? We need massive public relations and marketing plans because those jobs in supply chain sometimes can be invisible to the general public. Next slide. And it looks like we'll be wrapping this up in just a moment. A few findings of the workshop is that we also need some industry and government coordination. Government has a very large role to play in the funding, but how do we get that funding in certain areas? Right now, it is only for specific areas such as infrastructure, or on-dock rail, and where would that government funding be most effective? A lot of the policies that we have don't fit the current needs of the industry. You've got to have the infrastructure before we can have some mandates. And then greater level of communication, need to eliminate those conflicting regulations is very, very important. Sometimes, I've worked in policy for several decades, and what we have sometimes are different areas of government making mandates, but they're not talking to each other. We might have the environmental regulatory agencies making mandates on energy, but they're really not talking to the manufacturers of trucks or energy providers to find out when they'll be available. So sometimes one side doesn't understand what the other is doing. So some creation of incentives for data sharing is very important. And again, developing that workforce with apprenticeship programs and promoting technology would also be critical. So we think that the federal government is really best equipped for building that macro level cohesion and then addressing supply chain fragmentation, but allowing the states, to have some autonomy in how they address that at the state level, but having some coordination at the national level. We almost done here. I think we just have a couple of more slides. Vincent, if we can just move on to the next couple of slides, and we'll go through these very, very quickly. One of the things that we talked about is a 24/7 supply chain. How do we get the supply chain working more toward 24 hours? A lot of things that need to happen with that. So they're looking at how we can make that happen. Next slide, Victor or Vincent. Couple of the other outcomes, looking at capacity and utilization. How can we have that expanded capacity to increase those work hours? And then the hours of operation, we talk about 24/7, but do we really need 24/7, or would we get the same benefit from working 16/5 for certain sectors of the warehouses of the supply chain, such as trucking, port operations, and warehousing? Vincent, next slide. Buffer zones, looking at capacity shortage for storage and buffer zone location. How can we reduce those backlogs at the port and keep the cargo from piling up in one location or another? We talked about data sharing and modernization of our technology infrastructure. That's critical in order to move forward. Vincent, I think we have one more slide. And then we talked about the freight policy coordination. How are we able to better facilitate that communication between agencies and freight operators? We talked about having an advisory body at the state level, at the highest level, that would communicate directly with industry, but report directly to the governor, and have that person at that highest level as someone who really understands our industry, able to talk to all levels of the government and all of those agencies and have a little bit better coordination. I think that was our last slide.
And yeah, and Elizabeth, maybe if I just take one,
Please.
30 seconds to say, because I know a lot of those things are sort of still the big picture focus. But what did happen as a result of the summit on a couple of those issues is that Caltrans did identify parcels of land that it owned that could be used for short-term staging and to decongest the ports and to get some of the containers off docks. And they worked on developing an inventory of other land that was in and around the ports to accomplish the same. The information sharing goals were really lofty, but at a minimum, we had a discussion about if the trucking community and the terminal operators know how delayed the vessels are at arriving at the ports, it actually allows for better planning. So there was a general agreement to get information on ship delays to the terminals and to the other supply chain partners, which is amazing. It doesn't happen, but it does. And then on the industry council side, you may have noticed there have been a number of bills that have been introduced to develop something like an envoy to the port and supply chain sector. Some of these would require legislative or statutory changes, but there has been action at the state level to build sort of a statewide industry council that would provide more and regular feedback to the industry. So there were some concrete things that came out of this, maybe small in scale, but still significant, I think. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. O'Brien and Elizabeth. It's fascinating because we really need to address and correct this problem. And what I took away from the summit was a lot of it is if we can somehow link the data sharing, that would be most beneficial. So our next speaker is going to be Jane Tierney, and she's going to speak more. She works with individual manufacturers, so it'll be interesting to see her insight as well. Jane her company is Purple Inc., which was founded in 2015. With Purple Link, it's a tongue twister, clients develop skills to use with processes and tools to reclaim those dollars, return them to the bottom line, monitor and manage risk, and sustain savings year over year. So what she helps companies achieve is quite significant. In addition, She teaches operations and supply chain management courses in the California State University system. So there's a link there. And she's also on the advisory board for the operations and supply chain management at Cal State Long Beach. So, and in 2020, she co-founded the SoCal Supply Chain Roundtable for manufacturers, for local executives focus on supply chain risk management, which hosts an annual supply chain risk symposium. And maybe you can share a little bit of that with us. Jane, please.
Thank you, Elizabeth, and thank you to the MCIE for the opportunity to be here with you tonight. So yeah, I'm going to talk a little bit about shortages and disruptions and some of the things that are going on in the world, although many of you could probably write this, what's going on in more detail than I'm going to share with you. But I think it's an important thing to look at. We're going to look at a couple of the drivers, some things you might not be aware of. And then I'll give you some thoughts on what kinds of actions you might be able to take. So you want to go to the next slide, please? So these are just some of the disruption types that we typically see. And we're seeing these in different areas across the board. So in some industries, in some areas, we're seeing demand drop. I think people with inflation worries and things like that are not buying some more luxury type things. But at the same time, we're seeing demand surges in a lot of different areas. So there's been a lot of companies scrambling to keep up with demand. We've seen reduced productivity, but on the other hand, we've seen some increased productivity too from companies who report that maybe their work from home workforce has been more productive during the shutdowns. And then others maybe on site have had hits to their productivity level. So we're kind of seeing things across the board. We've seen a lot of access restrictions and storage restrictions. And I think Elizabeth and Tom talked about that a little bit, where we're looking for places to store trucks and trailers and things that when they do come in. And we all know that we've been shut down in China for a while, so they haven't been shipping things out as frequently. And so that's going to have to catch up at some point too. So that's been a restriction. And then as Elizabeth and Tom so eloquently said about this truck shortages, the driver shortages, a lot of those elements as well go into that. And we've all seen a lot of raw material shortages. How that affects you and your business depends on what kind of business you're in. If you're in the electronics business and you're trying to get chips, you've probably been scrambling. And I hate to tell you, but you're going to be scrambling for a while longer. When this first kind of came to light in early 2021, I did a talk on that, and I looked at my notes from that not too long ago. And I said at that point, this was like January, February of 2021. And I said, people are projecting that it's going to go well into 2022. So now they're unfortunately saying it's going to be probably through into 2024 and maybe throughout 2024 that we continue to see these shortages in chips. So, and we see car manufacturers that are shipping cars without all the chips in them. So not all of the bells and whistles work. So there's some different challenges with raw materials. We're seeing baby formula, which is not a raw material, but if you need that, it's pretty important. So that's a shortage too. And we're seeing a lot of different types of shortages, impacts, some temporary, some very looks like longer term. And companies are really assessing their reliance on outsourced manufacturing resources. So they're looking at where are we doing business? And typically up until the pandemic, companies really focused about 80–90% on tier 1 suppliers. But the pandemic exposed a lot of things that companies weren't aware of. And so now they're really not looking only at the tier 1 suppliers, but they're digging in to say what's happening with our tier 2 and tier 3 and on down, not only because we need to look at things like greenhouse gas emissions and conflict minerals, but because we need to know where they are and what our risk is associated with that. I remember at the beginning of 2020, I was talking to some people when they first announced the shutdown, and they said, oh yes, we're not really worried because we don't buy anything we don't buy anything from China, is what they told me. And I talked to them a couple months later, actually, and they said, wow, we have a few electronic things, but we had no idea how many things come from China and how that might affect us. And that's just continued to show itself and be more transparent throughout the pandemic. So can you go to the next slide, Vincent? Thank you. So we know the pandemic continues, and thankfully we are having some back to in-person events, and we're doing more travel. We're doing a lot of different things, but we know that there are still warnings and reports of the pandemic surging in areas. Recently in the Bay Area, I have colleagues in that area, and they said they had gone back to a work from home environment for a couple of weeks until they thought that surge passed. Luckily, we're seeing, with so many people being vaccinated, I think is a contributor, but we're seeing less severe consequences from the virus if you do get it, but a lot of people are still getting very, very sick, and there are still a number of deaths on a daily basis. So with all these different disruptions, there was a study that was done by the organization that says that 72% of CEOs are worried about losing their job this year, due primarily to disruptions, due to the activities that are going on, the problems that they're having. This was 3,000 executives, and it was done by Alex Partners. And so they've said their main challenges are material shortages and the rising costs of transportation and material. And 33% and 31% of the respondents said those were their two top issues. And then after that, it fell to 18%, and their worry there is about their ability to respond to unexpected events. I think this has made everybody more aware of the fact that there are so many risks lurking in supply chains, and when they come up, they surprise people and companies, and they're not able to respond as quickly as they would like. And the other issue they have, both of these are at 18%, were the non-availability of transportation capacity. So when they can't get what they need when they need the capacity and transportation to move it from place to place. So there's a lot of activity around this. And these same CEOs and executives, again, 3,000 executives, the 77% feel that their actions to address these disruptions just are not going to be enough. So they're running out of suggestions on what to do. They're running out of options. They've tried different things, some working a little bit, some not working so well. So we're going to see that more and more. And as the economy sends warning bells about inflation and possible recessions, and we still see different global supply chain issues, like again, the stoppage in the Shanghai area, especially for shipments due to the COVID shutdowns, the way that the Chinese government is handling that. And we've seen different governments across the globe handle it in different ways, but those impact the workers, impact the ability of companies to produce the goods. So disruptions are the number one concern of 69% of these CEOs. And yet that's not their only issue. Again, as Elizabeth and Tom talked about, there's a lot of hiring concerns. This great resignation kind of thing is quite a challenge for companies. And I was at an event, it was also a manufacturing alliance for the San Joaquin Valley. I was at that event last week, and one of the other speakers talked about the fact that if every person looking for a job today found one, there would still be 5 million jobs unfilled. So people are looking carefully at jobs. They're being very deliberate. They're taking this opportunity to try to get better positions for them, and better work circumstances, better benefits. So if companies want you, then companies are bending sideways to try to get people on board that will fit their needs and also fit their company environment. We also still have a lot of concerns about IT network management. So, Elizabeth stated some things at the beginning of this, that there are some IT connectivity issues. Some people are blaming Zoom. Some people are blaming the internet. And we all know that IT continues to be a challenge. And when people are struggling and challenged, then that's when we see more hackers and we see a lot more things with IT challenges in that area. And as I said before, COVID is not done with us yet. So next slide, please. So there are a lot of reasons that we have so many disruptions that we're seeing all across the globe today. Part of it is a lack of preparedness. And I said before, a lot of companies were very surprised by the extent of their risk exposure and the weaknesses in their supply chain that they just really didn't think about that much before the pandemic hit and started exposing a lot of things. And then, so they weren't prepared for this. I can speak for myself. And if you had told me in 2019 that we were going to have a pandemic in 2020, I would say, well, maybe in a third world country, but surely not here in the United States. And yet that's what we've been dealing with. So the preparedness is one piece of it. Another one is the flexibility. We've been told time and time to get processes, get standardization, do things, make things routine and best practices and those things like that. So what we found is we had some of those in place all across the board, and yet those processes weren't as flexible as they needed to be for a lot of companies. Many companies had to pivot. That word is a lot more popular than it was 2 years ago. Companies have had to pivot and change what they do, change what they make, change their capacity, their capabilities, a lot of things on the fly, trying to just stay alive during the last couple of years. So this has been exacerbated when companies have single and sole sources. So single sources may be a fine thing because the traditional definition of a single source is you just put all your business with that one supplier, but there should be low switching costs and there should be lots of suppliers that you can use in case this one doesn't work out for you. And what we found is that when that one supplier had a lot of issues, the competition that was supposed to be readily available wasn't necessarily so. And we've seen all kinds of issues like the freeze that was in the Texas and the southern part of the United States last spring. And companies are still dealing with reverberations from that, from the chemical availability. We're seeing chemicals change processes a little bit due to some regulations. And then anytime you have these in your finished goods, you may have to do things like requalifications and go through a lot of quality checks over and over again. We've seen a lot of resources diverted to things like vaccine manufacturing, PPE, a lot of healthcare kinds of products that weren't readily available 2 years ago that we needed. So we're seeing people pivot and we're seeing mundane products not as available as they were. And then anytime you have a sole source, you should know that that is a risk because that means by definition that it's going to be very hard to replace. But we saw a lot of companies have financial issues and needed help. So small businesses needed help from their bigger business customers to get through the pandemic. The added challenge from tariffs and things like that have been a real challenge. And we all know the price of gasoline is just having an effect across the board. So we've seen things, companies have had centralized procurement. Sometimes that's been good. Sometimes that's been a challenge. The single channel distribution, which in some instances was a great strategy, may not have been the best to be as flexible and to pivot throughout the last couple of years. And again, the visibility in the supply chain, I think, was limited because companies just did not recognize the need to get down to tier 2, 3, 4 suppliers in a lot of instances. So a lot of factors contributing to where we are. Next slide, please. So what we've seen is the things we've been talking about. We've seen product shipments delayed. I had a colleague who told me that they had a friend who was actually moving, I think from the Idaho area to Arizona, and they got everything packed up. They got things ready to go. The moving company came, loaded everything up, but then they had the trailer there with all their goods in it, and there was no driver. So it took them 2 weeks to get a driver that could drive from Idaho to Arizona and actually transport their goods. So in the meantime, they didn't have much choice. They left and went to Arizona. So this is a personal thing, but you can see that this translates to personal as well as business issues. So the shipment delays have been an issue, as we've talked about. A lot of quality issues. Companies with this great resignation, they've seen people leave. They've had to hire new people that aren't as trained. The quality issues have cropped up. People had very limited inventories because we had a school of thought that was very lean to keep as little inventory as you could. Maybe they overdid it a bit. And so when they got new inventory, there might have been quality issues. When companies are striving and struggling to catch up with these demand surges, sometimes things get bypassed and we have quality issues. A lot of companies lost revenue, again, tried to pivot to support that. And then a lot of companies have been reluctant to spend and to invest, even though they had plans to make capital investments or improvements or process improvements, to hire, to train and expand their skill set. So a lot of companies have dialed back on that and said, you know what, we're gonna keep this money in the bank for now. We're gonna wait on that, push that out a little bit. Even 6 months can have a big effect on the companies that were expecting that revenue. We've seen a lot of tarnished brands and bad reviews from companies who had practices people didn't like, companies who felt the impact of the last couple of years more strongly than others. So that reputation gets bad. And now we add into that things like the Ukrainian invasion. So companies that are continuing to do business in Russia are getting some bad reviews, and there's some boycotts on those kinds of things, as well as all the political turmoil and chaos that we have here in the United States and the fallout from that. And so we're seeing customers complain more, be less loyal because they found they couldn't count on companies anyway. They couldn't count on their suppliers or the brand that they had used. So now they have changed and they're not as loyal. They're flipping suppliers more quickly. And so that's adding a lot of havoc to the supply chains. Next slide, please. So when we look at these disruptions, there's a couple things we want to look at. We really want to look at the probability that something is going to occur. So after the disruption has already happened, we can say, okay, what's the extent of the impact? But when we're trying to be a little proactive and looking at, okay, maybe it happened once, what's the probability of it happening again or in another sector of my business? So, and then I'm not seeing this, but I know that these things are happening in other companies in my industry, in other companies in my area. So you're looking now for more risk, which is a good thing. We have a lot more proaction within companies trying to identify the risk and get ahead of it. So we're looking for the probability of something happening, and then we're looking at the other end and saying, if it does happen, how bad is the impact going to be? How strongly is that impact going to be and affect us? So companies are looking at that and trying to make those assessments as they deal with risk management. Next slide. So we're trying to measure the impacts. So again, that we understand the extent of the impact and we can figure out how to avoid it or how to mitigate it, how to lessen it, and definitely not let it repeat and repeat and repeat. So we're seeing all of these things: lost sales, higher freight costs, market share dilution, all kinds of different things that are going on. And companies are struggling to measure this and say, okay, how do we deal with this? And what does this tell us about going forward? Next slide. So 3 things that I think are important for companies to remember. The first is to try to restore some sense of order. And again, assurance of supply is always job one, right? I need parts to keep going. So make sure that you have your parts coming in, do what you need to do for that. Make sure that you're communicating and collaborating with both your customers and your suppliers. And it's important for companies to try to stabilize their cash flow. That's one of the important things to do. And then I think we need to be open to different ideas. So rethink the businesses that you're in and look for other opportunities and other areas to play in. So that means evaluating both capabilities and capacities, looking at efficiencies, productivity, being able to pivot, looking at flexibility and resiliency. And finally, I think that's going to require some redesign. Companies are looking at redesigning their operating models. In that same study I mentioned earlier, 80% of the executives said that they're going to have to change their operating models significantly in the next couple of years. So they're looking at what we need to do to survive. Companies are looking at next generation capabilities, and yet they're still looking for those key customer and supplier relationships that are crucial to them going forward, and making sure that they keep those intact so that they know what to do. Next slide. So Purple Link, what can help you with this? I have a line where you can do a callwithjane.com where you can set up a free call with me to talk about supply chain issues and anything that you can do. I put my email in the chat if you'd like to get in contact with me and discuss this in more detail, or look at how Purple Link might be able to help your business. And finally, I want to leave you with a slide that I think is important. My strive to thrive for the day is that learning and innovation go hand in hand. And the arrogance of success is to think that what you did yesterday is going to be sufficient for tomorrow. This was a statement from William Pollard, who sounds like he's pretty contemporary, but actually he was born in 1911, died in 1989, and was working on the Manhattan Project and several other kind of groundbreaking things during his career. He's also an Episcopal priest. So he's a good example of someone who managed to blend the spiritual and the scientific. And he's written a couple of books by that. Again, he's deceased, but I thought that this was an interesting statement from somebody who really was not anywhere near where we are today, but I think that this still applies kind of across the board. That's all I have. I thank you for your time, and we'll take questions.
Thank you, Jane. You're very insightful.
Thank you.
Quick question, Jane. Are you working with CMTC as well?
I am. I have recently started working with CMTC. Thank you for reminding me about that.
As a consultant?
Yes, yes.
Okay, okay.
Yeah.
This is Debbie. I have a quick question, Jane, or to any of the presenters. In our last workshop, someone mentioned that due to the shutdown in Shanghai, that things are only going to get worse. Is that what you see on the forecast as well? Is that this shutdown will continue to have this ripple effect and get worse over summer?
Well, I think it's the shutdown. I don't know that it's going to get worse, but when it opens back up, it's going to be, a clogged drain, trying to cram the proverbial 10
bottleneck.
pounds of stuff into a 5-pound bag. So it's going to be, a
Bottleneck.
textbook definition of a bottleneck. So it's going to be a different kind of challenge, but it's going to continue to be a challenge.
I would say
And
that
we'll
they're
have-
still trying to move freight as it stands right now. And it's just like you say, it's going to continue to get worse. We've had our own problems with the supply chain. It's the worst it's ever been too.
And I was going to add, we're going to be clearing up that backlog as we're anticipating increased demand for the holiday season, right? So we're back to that cycle. So yeah, it's going to get worse before it's going to get better.
Well, and I attended an event in San Bernardino, and I took all of you are familiar with the 10 freeway, just to see those miles upon miles of chassis loaded with double containers, and they're parked out there. And then I was at the Port of Los Angeles, And their containers stacked five to 9 high, and that's now. Where are we gonna put all this product that's supposedly coming in?
All of our Christmas goods and holiday goods that come in starting in about July of every year. Yeah, it's going to be a challenge.
Well, I kind of worry more about the stuff we really need to survive, the Christmas stuff and all that, it's just such fluff and there's so much of it. And I don't even, buy hardly anything anymore because I'm as old as I am and I have tons of stuff, but it just, it just seems so, oh goodness, like formula. You'd never have expected that to go the way it did. I'm just taken aback and
Well, and if it's
have to ride this
formula,
through.
and you heard now it's tampons and you're thinking, oh my God, what else is gonna go? And what's the nature of the breakdown? Because it's not just supply chain issues.
Oh,
There are internal breakdowns, there are
yes.
quality breakdowns. And then how do those get resolved?
Yeah, people, just getting the people has been really difficult.
And
It's
hanging
just
on to good people is difficult.
hanging on to good people. It used to be the labor force to me was very, it had its challenges, but now the supply chain is, I'm a manufacturer and I live and die by the materials that I have to order for my clients. And I was just mentioning it to somebody the other day is sometimes, the smaller fish doesn't always get the first, the first fruits, so to speak, from our suppliers. Sometimes the bigger, the clients get the, royal treatment where, I'm a smaller fish in a large pond. And so I don't, I really have to order even further out now and pay for things even further out, which again, my cash flow is then affected by that.
Right.
There's just a lot of things. I mean, the lead times on some things are unbelievable now. So again, just staying ahead of corrugated, the plastic, all of the things that go into these products and things that we, components that we sell our clients. So there's a lot of challenges coming up.
Well, and interesting because initially we were working in a just-in-time environment and holding
Yeah.
minimal inventory. Now, if you weren't already holding inventory, now we're in trouble. It's crazy monitoring that.
You're darned if you do, you're darned if you don't. Yeah.
Well, you also see this cause bad behavior from what I call bad actors, which is the hoarding kind of thing.
Yes.
So when there's a shortage, then people tend to hoard. So there are some hoarders out there, and there are some, again, bad actors that are just trying to take people to the cleaners because they can. So you see this a lot in the semiconductor industry. I was at a PCA manufacturer a couple weeks ago, and they said, excuse all these parts laying around, but there's one part we can't get. It's the part up until probably a year and a half ago cost $1.62. And he said the latest price that we got on those parts was $450. So he said, my customer is not willing to pay $450 for a $1.62 part. So they might pay, $30, but they're not going to pay that kind. So you got to say, is this really a good offering of a price, or is somebody just trying to gouge somebody? And it's both. There's a lot of that going on.
And it's important to keep in mind that that's not really a supply chain problem. It's a shift in where we decide to keep inventory, right? Whether it's semiconductors or toilet paper, it's our own sort of behavior that's influencing and forcing the supply chain to respond when there is
a lot of fear factor.
Yeah.
A lot of fear factor.
And Judy, you said you're a small business, but some of these large businesses can afford to pay some of those prices and are going to absorb that at least for a while. So, an automobile company has a lot more, lot less sensitivity to the price changes than a small business, even though they're trying to get the same part. So, but some of these parts, the prices are just outrageous. It just is like, this is not even reasonable.
Yeah.
We had some questions come through the chat. Troy Clark asked about regarding the Caltrans land to help get containers off ships faster. Would our region benefit from a transload facility to more efficiently get containers from the ports to the Inland Empire? And then he also had another question regarding data, but you might address that first one concerning Caltrans. I don't know who it goes to.
Since I brought it up, I'm happy to respond. And then if Elizabeth or Jane have any comments, please chime in. So the offer by Caltrans to look at land availability and and inventory other available lands was, I think, really a short-term solution. It is not efficient to transload within the region. Every time you touch the cargo, the container, it's going to add additional costs. And where the transloading does occur, and we have a great transloading and cross-docking infrastructure in Southern California. It's for that inland point intermodal, that IPI cargo that's heading, east of the Rockies. It's at that point that you can justify the additional touch of the cargo. I think it's really a short-term solution.
Yeah.
With regard to, it's really interesting, the challenge prize. For me, as a researcher, the question I have is, how do we get to accurate system-wide fluidity metrics? We have really good metrics that are captured at the modal level, the segment level within the supply chain. But what matters to as a performance metric to the trucking sector is not necessarily the same as the port sector, right? The delay in the system is borne by those actors differently. So a challenge grant that would get at the structure of a system-wide fluidity metric would be really helpful to a lot of people.
Great, thank you, Tom.
So
Appreciate it.
I'll add to that, because I was in Fresno last week, and there, another of the presentations at the meeting that I was also a presenter at, presented about a rail line from the Los Angeles area to that kind of, not the Inland Empire, but the San Joaquin Valley and those kinds of, and that area. And they have phase 1 approved. They've got some initial funding. They're looking for land to build a hub to put a rail line that will take things at least partway north. And there was quite a bit of discussion about that. And one of the questions was, what do the truckers think of that? And they said the truckers overwhelmingly support it, because they don't like to make those short runs between LA and Fresno, or even as far as San Francisco and whatever. So if you could put things on rails, then they could pick things up there and take them on further and whatever. So this is a big opportunity, I think. And there was quite a bit of buzz and excitement. So it's going to take a couple years, of course, to get it going. But the worry is, will it not be necessary or as necessary in 2 or 3 years when it gets up and running? So it's one of those challenges to kind of see how fast they can get that going. But I think that's an innovative idea, and I think a lot of companies, a lot of states and cities and companies are looking for, what can we do to alleviate some of this?
That's
Because
great.
we know
Thank you.
that those ports are constrained.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Ron, did you have a question?
Yeah, and perhaps a little bit of a discussion, but to hear you bring this up kind of reminds me of years and years, decades and decades ago, when you'd go into a manufacturer and they'd be pretty proud of the amount of inventory they had. They put their equity into inventory. They didn't put it in the bank. Then, of course, we went through that period of the 80s and the 90s and the early 2000s, where everything was just in time, and the finance people were making calculations about how much holding inventory is costing you, etc. Of course, money was cheap then, and it's no longer cheap. But it makes me wonder a little bit if just in time is dead. Do we have that sort of question? Part A. Part B is have we just been teetering on the edge with our transportation and supply infrastructure for maybe years and years and years, just barely keeping in front of the UPS truck and each of the different pieces? Because it seems like the disruption that we've had, while it's extraordinary, there's no question about that, it feels to me like we're way more fragile than maybe any of us ever imagined that we are. Any comments on that?
I agree.
Well, I'll say about the just in time that I think we went, we being American companies, went a little bit too far on that. I think it's still a good concept when it's practical, when you have lead times that support that, when you have interim and you've thought about what happens when you have problems.
Right.
That kind of goes to the single and sole source things I was talking about. So I think with that pendulum swung too far, but I think you don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Some of that is very sound principles, and when money's tight, you're still going to get more pressure from finance to get rid of some of that inventory. So I think that is something that needs to be evaluated on a case by case issue, and you know, get rid of the old, obsolete, and slow moving inventory. And if you can replenish quickly, then that's great. And if you can't replenish, that's what you need to have the safety stock on, not across the board.
And I would add, one of the things that our work on the summit clearly revealed, and we used for the entire initiative, we used the hashtag system of systems. It's really apparent that there is not just a supply chain, there are multiple supply chains, right? We found with food products, there were institutional users of the supply chain, schools and hospitals that had vanishing demand at the same time that demand was picking up in retail establishments, in shopping markets. So it may be that the just-in-time solution is appropriate for a particular kind of supply chain, but for not another. And that's where that question of, to me, the fluidity metrics really would help us understand the difference, and under what conditions and in what circumstances does just-in-time still work. I think Jane's exactly right. I wouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater, but having better information about the needs of a particular flow of goods would give us that answer.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. It's a little bit difficult to try and, especially for small companies, to try and figure out all of these different components, and what is the trucking demands to the East Coast versus bringing it in from China today. Those are things that small businesses just can't possibly manage and calculate. Even if the small companies really have the ability to crunch numbers and do forecasting in a variety of metrics, there are too many details to gather.
Right.
It would be nice to have access to something like a commodities market where you could tell not only how much corn was, but where it was and how long it took to get to you.
Yeah.
Ron, if I can just make a comment about your comment about the fragility of the system and that we're just a step ahead. You're absolutely right. We've been, for the last 25 years, we have been just one step ahead. Though I started off my port career 27 years ago at the Port of Los Angeles, working on a construction project that was some of the last projects of the port's 2020 plan. The 2020 plan was a master plan that they started in the 1980s, trying to get to 2020, never seeing the exponential growth at the ports that we've seen in the last 20 years, because no one knew of the internet or Amazon and same day delivery, at that, or next day delivery at that time. One of the things that happened, I live in San Pedro. For many years, I lived about a quarter of a mile from the main channel of the port. Now I live, as the crow flies, about 2 miles or less from the port. And one of the things that's happened in the last 25 years is, as the ports have grown and encroached on the surrounding communities, the communities have been opposed. And I'm sure you're all familiar with the term NIMBY.
Yeah.
Yep. So the surrounding communities around the ports have really thrown a wrench into their expansion plans. So the ports are expanding, they are becoming more efficient, but they have had to scale back over the last 20 years just because the community is absolutely adamantly opposed against too
Mhm.
much, too much growth around the ports. But we've also seen that, not if you're, for those of you who may or may not be familiar with the harbor area, if you're in the Inland Empire, they have opposed the expansion of the 710 freeway, the southern end that, that feeds the port. There has been, in recent years, a lot of opposition to expansion of warehouses and distribution centers in the Inland Empire. As some have grown, now there's a little bit of opposition there. So getting the political will, getting through the environmental process, having communities not be opposed, then getting the funding, hundreds of millions of dollars, if not billions of dollars, whether it's through private or through government funding, they're all challenges. And some of our projects at the ports can take anywhere from 10 to 15 years to get approved. And 2 terminals at the ports, one at the Port of Long Beach and one at the Port of LA, both took over 10 to 12 years to go through the entire process. So when you're looking at planning, a lot happens in 10 to 12 years when you're looking at supply chain issues and you're looking at cargo volumes.
Mhm.
So it's a constant game of playing catch up. And now with the pandemic, who knows what's going to happen in the next few years.
Well, I want to thank everybody for being here. I was going to ask one more question, but you just answered it, Elizabeth, when you said, who knows? I was going to ask, when is this going to be over? And I was going to ask, what can manufacturers do to help facilitate a change? But I think you
Okay.
said, who knows?
A lot of prayer. Only God knows.
Yeah, but thank you very
Crystal
much.
ball.
Thank you very much,
Amen.
Elizabeth Flynn, for putting this together, and Jane for being here, and Elizabeth Warren for being here. I know you have to run off. You're late for your tennis game already, I'm sure. And Dr. Thomas O'Brien,
Thank
we
you,
really
everybody.
appreciate having you. Great information.
Thanks for inviting us.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for
Bye.
having
Thank you
us.